Hi, I'm Stephen Carson, coming at you from St. Louis, Missouri, in these United States. A little delayed on the start in both when I scheduled it to start and when I actually started, because the battery in my car was smoking and we had to deal with that. When the battery is smoking, it's time to replace it, just in case you didn't guess. Okay, let me make sure I can see the chat on YouTube, and I shared the link on Twitter. Support for the show is gratefully received on Subscribestar. You can find the link over on YouTube if you go over there in the video description. And I do broadcast to Twitter and YouTube. I probably could broadcast to more places, but that's what I'm doing right now, in case you prefer one over the other. Okay. This is really fun. Thanks to Jeff Deist, former president of the Mises Institute, now at Monetary Metals, for recommending to me this book, Class. Here, let's hold up better. Class by Paul Fussell, A Guide Through the American Status System. This is, well, he starts it right. Chapter 1 is called A Touchy Subject, because as he says, Americans are really uncomfortable. And before asking them about things having to do with class, you have to get through the obligatory, hey, well, look at this. Grant in the chat says, of course we have socioeconomic classes. I think the main difference was they weren't rigid and based on birth. For much of the history of the US, most people elsewhere in the world were born into much more rigid class structures. Still, many places have these. And he says, short version, I think when people say America doesn't have a class society, it's more about the ability to change which one you are in. Well, let's keep those thoughts, but thank you, Grant, for illustrating the very first point he makes in the book, which is that it makes Americans feel self-conscious, and they also tend to deny that there's class. He says one woman, asked by a couple of interviewers if she thought there were social classes in the country, answered, "It's the dirtiest thing I've ever heard of." And a man asked the same question, got so angry that he blurted out, "Social class should be exterminated." I wonder if there's a bit of boomer truth here, or if this is something that goes back even farther. The book, by the way, I've tried to, I'm going to try to skip over most of the dated references to how people were dressing at the time. The book was published in 1983. So some people I noticed on Amazon complained about some of the dated references. I'll try to skip those. But anyway, he's firmly writing from the post-World War II era, the boomer truth era. I wonder how much this was true in 1920 or 1890 in the US, that people, Americans would tend to deny that there were social classes. He says, in fact, you reveal a great deal about your social class by the amount of annoyance or fury you feel when the subject is brought up. So let's begin. So I said in advertising this stream that when you, we're going to learn about social class in America, and we'll learn to identify where we are in there. So let me just warn you up front, this might get a little uncomfortable. Reading this, I found it was hitting close to home sometimes, shall we say. So if that makes you feel uncomfortable, go now. But I found this book really funny. We're not going to cover all of it, what I've read so far. I found the book really funny and insightful, and also uncomfortable. Okay, so when the subject of class is brought up, it's telling how you react to that. A tendency to get very anxious suggests that you are middle class and nervous about slipping down a rung or two. On the other hand, upper class people love the topic to come up. The more attention paid to the matter, the better off they seem to be. Proletarians generally don't mind discussions of the subject because they know they can do little to alter their class identity. Thus, the whole class matter is likely to seem like a joke to them. The upper classes fatuous in their empty aristocratic pretentiousness, the middles loathsome in their anxious gentility. It is the middle class that is highly class sensitive, and sometimes class scared to death. One more story about reactions to this. A representative of that class the middle class, left his mark on a library copy of Russell Weins's The Tastemakers from 1954, next to a passage patronizing the insecure decorating taste of the middle class and satirically contrasting its artistic behavior to that of some more sophisticated classes. This offended reader scrawled in large capitals, "Bullshit!" And the author says, "A hopelessly middle-class man, if I ever saw one." Okay, so so if you reveal your class by your outrage at the very topic, you reveal it also by the way you define the thing that's outraging you. At the bottom, people tend to believe the class is defined by the amount of money you have. There's going to be a lot of meta here up front, right, of thinking about what class is, how people think about class. But I think that's pretty interesting too. So at the bottom, the amount of money you have. That's what class means. Rich people are upper class. Poor people are lower class. In the middle, people grant that money has something to do with it, but think education and the kind of work you do almost equally important. Nearer the top, people perceive that, listen carefully, taste, values, ideas, style, and behavior are indispensable criteria of class, regardless of money or occupation or education. So quite different views as you go from the bottom to the top of what class even means. Being told that there are no social classes in the place where the interviewee lives is an old experience for sociologists. "We don't have classes in our town," almost invariably is the first remark recorded by the investigator, reports Leonard Reisman, author of Class in American Life. Once that has been uttered and is out of the way, the class divisions in the town can be reported with what seems to be an amazing degree of agreement among the good citizens of the community. So I guess because we're Americans, we have to say, yeah, we don't believe in that class stuff. But in fact, we do. And we're aware of it, and we know who is in what class. You're just not supposed to talk about it, you know? Or as the Black community says in America, you don't talk about that when the mic is on, right? Class distinctions in America are so complicated and subtle that foreign visitors often miss the nuances and sometimes even the existence of a class structure. So powerful is the fable of equality, as Frances Trollope called it when she toured America in 1832. Okay, so this is well before World War II. So embarrassed is the government to confront the subject, in the thousands of measurements pouring from its bureaus, social class is not officially recognized. Right? So we will talk about middle income and higher upper income and lower income in our stats, our official government stats, but not social class. And so this makes it easy for visitors not to notice the way the class system works. Let's see, skip forward a bit. So if foreigners often fall for the official propaganda of social equality, that's the official American line, right? We're just folks. We're all just folks. The locals tend to know what's what, even if they feel uneasiness talking about it. When the acute Black from the South asserts of an ambitious friend that Joe can't class with the big folks, we feel in the presence of someone who's attended to actuality, to reality. Like the carpenter who says, I hate to say there are classes, but it's just that people are more comfortable with people of like backgrounds. Is that a heresy to say that? People are more comfortable with people of like backgrounds? His grouping of people by like backgrounds, scientifically uncertain as it may be, is nearly as good a way as any to specify what it is that distinguishes one class from another. And I love this line, listen to this. If you feel no need to explicate your allusions, not I, allusions, or in any way explain what you mean, you're probably talking with someone in your class. So he's saying there's a comfort in being with other people of your class. They get it. You don't have to spell it out. You can. It's more efficient communication when you're communicating with someone in your class. Let's put it that way, right? Okay, so caveat for this book. Sorry, alt-writers, that might be disappointing here, but he says, I'm going to deal with some of the visible and audible signs of social class, but I'll be sticking largely with those that reflect choice. It means he's not going to really consider matters of race or not that much religion or politics. So this is going to be strictly speaking about social class. I'll let the reader, let the listener think about how this maps to other categories we might think of. Okay, in attempting to make sense of indicators like these, the visual indicators, the noticeable indicators, I've been guided by perception and feel rather than by any method that could be deemed scientific, believing that class is too serious a subject to leave to the social scientists. It should be a serious subject in America, Fussell says, especially because here we lack a convenient system of inherited titles, ranks, and honors, and each generation has to define the hierarchies all over again. The society changes faster than any other on Earth, and the American, almost uniquely, can be puzzled about where in the society he stands. So this is a case where the point that Grant made in the comments there, he actually would grant some truth to that it is a little more dynamic, and because of that, it's a little harder to understand where you stand. Not obvious. That's why I thought it would be interesting to talk about this, in part, to use to sort of identify class in others, but to identify it in ourselves, right? That know thyself, right? Is another aspect of it. Americans find knowing where you stand harder than do most Europeans. It seems no accident that, as the British philosopher Anthony Quinton says, the book of etiquette in its modern form is largely an American product, the great names being Emily Post and Amy Vanderbilt. The reason is that the United States is preeminently the venue of newcomers, with a special need to place themselves advantageously and to get on briskly. So some newcomers, says Quinton, are geographical, that is immigrants. Others are economic, the newly rich. How am I supposed to act now that I'm a millionaire or billionaire? Others, again, chronological, just the young, trying to find their way, right? All are faced with the problems inseparable from the operations of a mass society, earning respect. Let's see. The Irish poet Thomas More, this struck me, sensing the special predicament Americans were inviting with their egalitarian constitution, described the citizens of Washington, D.C. as creatures born to be slaves and struggling to be lords. By the way, some of the things I'm going to choose to read, I just think they're funny. They're just a lot of amazing little observations and quotes. Alexis de Tocqueville in Democracy in America put his finger precisely on the special problem of class aspiration in the U.S. Nowhere, he wrote, do citizens appear so insignificant as in a democratic nation. And so nowhere, consequently, is there more strenuous effort to achieve, earn, would probably not be the right word, significance. Where he's summarizing something Walt Whitman, he said, where everybody is somebody, nobody is anybody. Let's see. So the special hazards attending the class situation in America, where movement appears so fluid and where the prizes seem available to anyone who's lucky, are disappointment and, following close on that, envy. Because the myth conveys the impression that you can readily earn your way upward. Disillusion and bitterness are particularly strong when you find yourself trapped in a class system you've been half persuaded isn't important. Right? I was promised I could, anybody can be president in America or whatever. Then suddenly you hit some kind of glass ceiling, right? De Tocqueville perceived the psychic dangers. In democratic times, he granted, enjoyments are more intense than in the ages of aristocracy, and the number of those who partake in them is vastly larger. But, he added, in egalitarian atmospheres, man's hopes and desires are oftener blasted. I like that language there. The soul is more stricken and perturbed, and care itself more keen. And after blasted hopes, envy. So there's envy, as we know, is a sin, right? So there's a moral danger with sort of being in denial about class and then running into the reality of it and being bitter, envious, right? So so this stream is here to help you, here to help us. Me too. Let's see. Push far enough, class envy issues in revenge egalitarianism, which the humorist Roger Price in The Great Rube Revolution, 1970, distinguishes from democracy in this way. Democracy demands that all of its citizens begin the race even. Egalitarianism insists that they all finish even. These are great lines. A lot of great quotes in this book. Yeah, oh, and if you don't know about this, I should include this just in case somehow you don't know about this. Then we get the situation satirized in L.P. Hartley's novel Facial Justice, 1960, about the prejudice against good looks in a future society somewhat like ours. There, inequalities of appearance are redressed by government plastic surgeons. But the scalpel isn't used to make everyone beautiful, it's used to make everyone plain. Very similar to Harrison Bergeron, if you know that great story by Vonnegut. Despite our public embrace of political and judicial equality, in individual perception and understanding, much of which we refrain from publicizing, we arrange things vertically and insist on crucial differences in value. So I thought that, I quoted that on Twitter. I want to read it again. He's saying we've got sort of the official stance, the public stance. Like I said, we're all just folks, right? But but we see something different in the behavior. It's in economics we talk about revealed preferences versus stated preferences, right? So our stated preference is political and judicial equality, and in America everybody's equal. But in individual perception and understanding, much of which we keep quiet about, we arrange things vertically and insist on crucial differences in value. So there's a certain hypocrisy there, I think is what he's saying, right? We talk equal, but we think differently, that we don't like to talk about it. It's as if in our heart of hearts, we don't want agglomerations, but distinctions. Perhaps you can see why there's a sort of a right-wing point in going through this, right? He's saying that there's an ideology of egalitarianism, of mashing everybody together, of a lack of distinctions. But if we watch carefully, we notice that people do make distinctions and even want to make distinctions, right? I think that's quite interesting. Okay. There seems no place where hierarchical status orderings aren't discoverable. Take musical instruments. In a symphony orchestra, the customary ranking of sections recognizes the difficulty and degree of subtlety of various kinds of instruments. Strings are on top, woodwinds just below, then brass, and at the bottom, percussion. On the difficulty scale, the accordion is near the bottom, violin near the top. Another way of assigning something like social class to instruments is to consider the prestige of the group in which the instrument is customarily played. As the composer Edward T. Cohn says, if you play a violin, you can play in a string quartet or symphony orchestra, but not in a jazz band, and certainly not in a marching band. Which reminds me of the great scene in a Woody Allen movie where he plays cello in a marching band. They actually show this. It's really funny. Anyway, among woodwinds, therefore, flute and oboe, which are primarily symphonic instruments, are better, social class higher, right, than the clarinet, which can be symphonic, jazz, or band. Among brasses, the French horn ranks highest because it hasn't customarily been used in jazz. Among percussionists, timpani is high for the same reason, and so on and so forth. And then he makes a claim that my friend Sandbach contested a bit on Twitter. Look that up if you get a chance. The guitar was the perfect instrument for the purpose of signaling young people's flight in the 60s and 70s from the upper middle and middle classes, associated as the guitar is with gypsies, cowhands, and other personnel without inherited or often even earned money and without fixed residence. So I may be a middle-class kid, but I got a guitar. So that makes me, I'm a wild guy. Okay, wild and crazy guy. The former socialist and editor of the Partisan Review, William Barrett, looking back 30 years, concludes that the classless society looks more and more like a utopian illusion. The socialist countries develop a class structure of their own, although there, he points out, the classes are very largely based on bureaucratic toadying. Since we are bound, he asks, to have classes in any case, in other words, even in after a communist revolution, you end up with classes, right? So he's like, okay, we're going to have classes, it looks like. Looks like we can't escape it. It's another utopian attempt to escape reality, right? If we're going to have classes in any case, why not have them in the more organic, heterogeneous, and variegated fashion indigenous to the West? And since we have them, the author says, why not know as much as we can about them? The subject may be touchy, but it need not be murky forever. Okay, I'm about to have a slide up so we can start thinking about classes, but he's going to introduce this a little bit by talking about various ways that people have divided, different numbers of classes, how they think about it. Okay. Nobody knows for sure what the word class means, he says. Some people, like Vance Packard, have tried to invoke more objective terms, have spoken about status systems. Followers of the sociologist Max Weber tend to say class when they're talking about the amount of money you have and the kind of leverage it gives you. They say status when they mean your social prestige in relation to your audience. And they say party when they're measuring how much political power you have, that is, how much built-in resistance you have to being pushed around by shits. Well, that was a great line. Anyway, by class, I mean all three. The author means all three, with perhaps extra emphasis on status. I do wish the word caste were domesticated in the United States. That's, of course, C-A-S-T-E, caste, because it nicely conveys the actual rigidity of class lines here, the difficulty of moving, either upward or downward, out of the place where you were nurtured. So notice he's already addressing this thing that Grant had brought up in the chat of mobility. He's saying we're a bit less mobile than we think we are. Okay. How many classes are there? The simplest answer is that there are two, the rich and the poor, employer and employed, landlord and tenant, bourgeois and proletariat. Or to consider manners rather than economics and politics, there are gentlemen and there are cads. Asked by a team of sociologists what's involved in social class, one respondent said, whether you have couth or are uncouth. And there's a social division distinguishing those who entertain in their domestic premises and those who wouldn't think of it. Paul Blumberg notes a fundamental class cleavage today between people who can afford to buy a house, any house, and people who can't. A fairly elevated version of the distinction down below between those who own cars and those who must depend on public transportation and who thus spend a great deal of their time waiting around for the bus to show up. In her book, Class, 1981, British humorist Jilly Cooper suggests a bipartite social scene in which the two parties are the guilty and the cross. On the one side are the middle and upper classes feeling guilty and riddled with social concern, although they often earn less money than the workers. On the other are the working classes, who have been totally brainwashed by television and magazine images of the good life, and feel cross because they aren't getting a big enough slice of the cake. Let's see, he talks a bit about army stuff. I'm going to skip that. Another thing to think about is that all work everywhere is divided into two sorts, safe and dangerous. Every year, 100,000 workers, this is back in '83, every year 100,000 workers are killed or die of work-related accidents or disease. 400,000 are disabled. 6 million are hurt at work. In the working class majority, Andrew Levison says, all the cliches and pleasant notions of how the old class divisions have disappeared are exposed as hollow phrases by the simple fact that American workers must accept serious injury and even death as part of their daily reality, while the middle class does not. This is, okay, I wasn't going to read this, but he goes on, Levison goes on, imagine the universal outcry that would occur if every year Several corporate headquarters routinely collapsed like mines, crushing 60 or 70 executives. Speaking of death and injury, probably the most awful class division in America, one that cuts deeply across the center of society and that will poison life here for generations, is the one separating those whose young people were killed or savaged in the Vietnam War, and those who, thanks largely to the infamous S2 deferment for college students, escaped. Now, I don't know that that gets talked as much about now, but I was alive back in '83. And even after that, I remember it was a big deal to say he was a draft dodger. You know, a politician would be called out for having avoided being in the Vietnam War, or if you were in the Vietnam War, like John McCain, you'd play it up, even if perhaps your behavior during that war is something. Anyway, that's a rabbit hole. Anyone uncertain about class consciousness in this country should listen to a working class father whose son was killed in Vietnam. I'm bitter. You bet your goddamn dollar I'm bitter. It's people like us who give up our sons for the country. The business people, they run the country and make money from it. The college types, the professors, they go to Washington and tell the government what to do. But their sons, they don't end up in the swamps over there in Vietnam. No, sir. Powerful. And a mother adds, we can't understand how all those rich kids, the kids with beads from the suburbs, how they got off when my son had to go. Okay, so there's the two-part division that he just went through from various angles. There are various ways to do a two-part division. And then, of course, there's the three-part division. As he says, it's 3 is the magic number, right? And so you have your upper, middle, lower classes. Matthew Arnold termed them the barbarians at the top. He'll reference that later. Philistines in the middle, and the populace at the bottom. And so this is a very typical way that you're probably used to hearing about classes. And he's going to have a nod to that. He says sociologists like to do upper, upper middle, middle, lower, and lower. He's going to do something different. And I should have this queued up here. Here we go. So this is Paul Fussell's division. He says, my researches have persuaded me that there are 9 classes in this country as follows, and I'll read them for those who aren't looking at the screen. Top out of sight, that's a number 1. Then upper middle. Then moving into the next bracket, or the middle bracket, the middle class, the high proletarian, mid proletarian, and low proletarian. And then finally, the destitute and the bottom out of sight. So it's a little strange at first, but as he starts walking us through this, I think you'll see that there's something to it. He says, one thing to get clear at the outset is this. It's not riches alone that defines these classes. It can't be money, one working man says quite correctly, because nobody ever knows that about you for sure. Style and taste and awareness are as important as money. George Orwell wrote, economically, no doubt there are only 2 classes, the rich and the poor, but socially there is a whole hierarchy of classes, and the manners and traditions learned by each class in childhood are not only very different, but this is the essential point, generally persist from birth to death. It is very difficult to escape culturally from the class into which you have born. When John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the author, go back to the author here, when John Fitzgerald Kennedy, watching Richard Nixon on television, turned to his friends and horror-struck said, the guy has no class. He was not talking about money. Okay, so let's see. He continues to argue a bit about it not exactly being about money, or not precisely. It's related to money, but you can't simply map class to money. He says, down below, the principle still holds, money doesn't matter that much. To illustrate the point, John Brooks compares 2 families living in adjoining houses in a suburb. One man is blue collar, a garage mechanic. The other is white collar, an employee in a publishing house. They make roughly the same amount of money, but what a difference. Mr. Blue, the blue collar guy, bought a small, neat ranch house. Mr. White bought a beat-up old house and refurbished it himself. Mrs. Blue uses the local shops, especially those in the nearby shopping center, and thinks them wonderful, so convenient. Mrs. White goes to the city to buy her clothes. The Blues drink, but rather furtively, and usually on Saturday night with the curtains closed. The Whites drink openly, often right out in the backyard. The Blues shout to each other from room to room of their house or from corner to corner of their lot without self-consciousness. The Whites modulate their voices to the point where they sometimes can't hear each other. As household objects, books are a crucial criterion. There's not a book in the Blues house, while the Whites' living room contains numerous full bookshelves. Guilty. Brooks concludes, here in sum are two families with hardly anything in common, yet their incomes are practically identical. So I went through all that because he's trying to illustrate, get your head off just strictly like income figures. That's not going to really tell the story he's trying to tell here about class. And so he says, not that the three classes at the top, top, out of sight, upper, and upper middle, don't have money. The point is that money alone doesn't define them. For the way they have their money is largely what matters. That is, as a class indicator, the amount of money is less significant than the source. The main thing distinguishing the top three classes from each other is the amount of money inherited in relation to the amount currently earned. The top out-of-sight class, and this would be like the Rockefellers, the Pews, the DuPonts, Mellons, Fords, Vanderbilts, lives on inherited capital entirely. So the source of their money is their inheritance, right? No one whose money, no matter how copious, comes from his own work, film stars are an example, can be a member of that very top class, the top out of sight, he calls it. Even if the size of his income and the extravagance of his expenditure permit him to simulate identity with it. Inheritance, or old money in the vulgar phrase, is the indispensable principle defining the top three classes. And it's best if the money's been in the family for 3 or 4 generations. Oh, got to share this one because it's about my state. There are subtle local ways to ascertain how long the money's been there. Touring Middle America, the British traveler Jonathan Rabin came upon the girl Sally, who informed him that new money says Missouri, old money says Missouri. When I think of a really rich man, says a Boston blue collar, I think of one of those estates where you can't see the house from the road. Hence the name of the top class, which could just as well be called the class in hiding. Their houses are never seen from the street or road. They like to hide away deep in the hills or way off on Greek or Caribbean islands, which they tend to own. Safe for the moment from envy and its ultimate attendants, confiscatory taxation, and finally expropriation. It was the Great Depression, Vance Packard speculates, that badly frightened the very rich, teaching them to be discreet, almost reticent in exhibiting their wealth. And the reason Packard's speculating about this is because this was a change from how it used to be. From the 30s dates the flight of money from such exhibitionist venues as the mansions of Upper Fifth Avenue to hideaways in Virginia, Upper New York State, Connecticut, Long Island, and New Jersey. The situation now is very different from the one in the 1890s, satirized by Thorstein Veblen in The Theory of the Leisure Class. In his day, the rich delighted to exhibit themselves conspicuously, with costly retainers and attendants much in evidence. Now they hide, not merely from envy and revenge, but from expose journalism, much advanced in cunning and ferocity since Veblen's time, and from an even worse threat, virtually unknown to Veblen, foundation mendicancy, with its hordes of beggars in three-piece suits constantly badgering the well-to-do. Showing off used to be the main satisfaction of being very rich in America. Now the rich must skulk and hide. And the author says, it's a pity. Worth meditating on why Paul Fussell thinks it's a pity that the rich now hide, and whether you agree. It's not just that the individual houses and often the persons of the top of out of sights are removed from scrutiny. Their very class tends to escape the down-to-earth calculations of sociologists and poll takers and consumer researchers. It's not studied because it's literally out of sight. If you send a questionnaire to a top out-of-sight person, they're going to hurl it to the floor with disdain. In fact, the way it would be ignored by a bottom out-of-sight person. Notice at the very bottom, he also calls them out-of-sights. It's here that we begin to perceive one of the most wonderful things about the American class system. The curious similarity, if not actual brotherhood, of the top and bottom out-of-sights. Just as the tops are hidden away on their islands or behind the peekaboo walls of their distant estates, the bottoms are equally invisible. When not put away in institutions or claustrated in monasteries, lamasseries, or communes, then hiding from creditors, deceived bail bondsmen, and gold merchants intent on repossessing cars and furniture. The bottoms, the lower or spurious leisure class, Veblen calls them, share something more with the top out-of-sights. They do not earn their money. The bottom out-of-sights are given it. They're kept afloat not by their own efforts or merits, but by the welfare machinery or the correctional system, the way the tops owe it all to their ancestors. And a further similarity, members of both classes carry very little cash on their persons. You might remember George Bush. I think George H.W. Bush, the first President Bush, was doing a presidential thing and went to a grocery store, and they showed him scanning an item to get the price. And he was startled by this. He'd never seen it. Meaning he'd never gone and bought groceries for himself. It's hard for most of us to imagine, right? Okay, so that's the top out of sight. We're going to go one by one here with reference back and forth, right? But the next class down, the upper class. So we're done with top out of sight. Now we're talking about the upper class. So they differ from the top out of sight class in two main ways. First, although it inherits a lot of its money, it earns quite a bit too, usually from some attractive, if slight, work without which it would feel bored and even ashamed. Uppers are likely to make their money by controlling banks and the more historic corporations, think tanks, and foundations, and to busy themselves with things like the older universities, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Foreign Policy Association, the Committee for Economic Development, and the like, together with the executive branch of the federal government and often the Senate. In the days when ambassadors were amateurs, they were selected largely from the uppers, the upper class, very seldom from the top out of sight. And secondly, unlike the top out of sights, the upper class is visible, often ostentatiously so. So the top out of sights are hiding. The uppers are not. When you pass a house with a would-be impressive facade visible from the street or highway, you know it's occupied by a member of the upper class. The White House itself is probably the best example. Its residents, even on those occasions when they're Franklin D. Roosevelt's or John F. Kennedy's, can never be designated top out of sight, but at the most upper class. The house is simply too showy, being pure white and carefully positioned on high ground, and temporary residence there usually constitutes a come down for most of its occupants. The White House is a hopelessly upper class place. Or even lower than that, he comments, as when the Harry Trumans lived there. He says, no person is located within one of these class categories exclusively. Consider William Randolph Hearst and his establishment at San Simeon. The location is in a way top out of sight, for the house isn't visible from the highway, the nearest public access. But the facade of the main building, once you penetrate through the miles of outdoor park and zoo, is designed to evoke respect, or rather awe, in the breast of the apprehender, and that indicates how very untop out of sight Hearst remained, despite his pseudo-aristocratic airs. He cared too much what effect he was having on people. Like all the classes, the upper class has its distinct stigmata. It will be in the social register, for example, whereas the mere upper middle class will not be, although the upper middle class wants to be. Having streets named after you is a signal that you are probably upper class. at least if the street name's your surname. Speaking French fluently, even though French is irrelevant to one's actual life, is an upper class sign. Not smoking at all is very upper class, but in any way calling attention to one's abstinence drops one to middle class immediately. The constant coming and going of house guests is an all but infallible upper class sign, implying as it does plenty of spare bedrooms to lodge them in, and no anxiety about making them happy, what with all the drinks, foods, games, parties, etc. Entertaining, right? Entertaining people. It is among members of the upper class that you have to refrain from uttering compliments, which are taken to be rude. Possessions there being, of course, beautiful, expensive, and impressive without question. The paying of compliments is a middle-class convention, for this class needs the assurance compliments provide. In the upper class, there's never any doubt of one's value, and it all goes without saying. Here's an example. Story. A British peer of a very old family was once visited by an artistic young man who, entering the dining room, declared that he'd never seen a finer set of Heppel-white chairs. His host had him ejected instantly, explaining, "Fellow praised my chairs. Damned cheek." Although not an infallible sign, because the upper middle classes learn to ape it, devotion to horses, owning them, breeding them, riding them, racing them, chasing small animals while sitting on them, is a fairly trustworthy upper class mark. But it is finally by a characteristic the American upper class shares with all aristocracies that ye shall know them, their imperviousness to ideas and their total lack of interest in them. Their inattention to ideas is why Matthew Arnold calls the uppers barbarians. He imputes their serenity specifically to their never having had any ideas to trouble them. So we now come to the upper middle class, to the next one. I'm hoping I can get through all this. I think I'm going to do less than I thought, because I'm realizing just how long. Part of the reason it's taking so long is I found this book absolutely delightful, and I don't want to stop. I don't want to spare the details that struck me. Give me just a sec. I just want to see the chapter after this one is really fun. But yeah, let's finish this, and then I'll tell you what's coming next, and we'll probably keep going with this book because I think it's great. Okay, so we did top, out of sight, and upper. Let's talk about upper middle. Okay, we now come to the upper middle class. The difference with the two classes above it is that it has earned most of it in law, medicine, oil, shipping, real estate, or even the more honorific kinds of trade like buying and selling works of art. They may enjoy some inherited money and use inherited things like silver or oriental rugs. The upper middles suffer from a bourgeois sense of shame, a conviction that to live on the earnings of others, even forebears, is not quite nice. So you got to make your own way, right? Obviously, the top, out of sight class has no concern about their child making their own way, right? That's not how they're thinking at all. They're thinking more about how do we keep the family legacy going through the next generation. Right? Caste marks of the upper middles would include living in a house with more rooms than you need. Another sign of the upper middle class is its chastity in sexual display. And he goes into details that don't sound dated about sort of the swimming suits and shorts and so forth that the upper middles are going to wear. He says, this class is also the most role reversed of all. Men think nothing of cooking and doing housework. Women of working out of the house in journalism, the theater, or real estate. If the wife stays home all the time, the family's middle class only. So that holds you back if your wife's at home from being upper middle. Most people of the middle classes and below would rather be in the upper middle class than even the upper or the top, out of sight. Recent Lewis Harris polls showed that when asked what class they'd like to be in, most said the middle class. And when asked what part of the middle class they'd like to be in, most said the upper middle class. Being in the upper middle class is a familiar and credible, believable fantasy, right? Its usages, while slightly grander than one's own, are recognizable and compassable. Whereas in the higher classes, you might be embarrassed by not knowing how to eat caviar, or use a finger bowl, or discourse in French. It's a rare American who doesn't secretly want to be upper middle class. In other words, you want to mostly keep your ways, but just with more money, right? Whereas when you get into the upper and the top out of sight, that's just like a different life. It's a different set of expectations on you. Okay, skipping a bunch of stuff that's very, I think, specific, a little dated. He says there's something that the upper middle class has, which is a sense of relaxation, play, and to a degree, irony. In any other class, we can imagine people contriving euphemisms for let's fuck. We can imagine, indeed, members of any other class coming up with the colorful invitation, let's hide the salami. But it's unlikely that any but the upper middle class would say, as the official preppy handbook records, let's play hide the salami, and then affectionately abbreviate salami to salam, the way it abbreviates Bloody Marys to bloodies and gin and tonics to G&Ts. It's all a game, in fact, the game of life, with the upper middle class, and hence its natural leaning toward frivolities like golf and tennis and yachting. So, let's start talking a little bit about geography. So he says, before proceeding downward from these three top classes, we must pause to consider the importance of geographical place in defining them. People from the middle and prole classes will be tempted to imagine that place has little to do with class, that you can belong to the top classes just anywhere. Nothing could be more wrong. There are tens of thousands of places in the United States grand enough to have earned a zip code number. Given sufficient knowledge and a fine taste, it would be possible to rank them all according to their various degrees of class, from Grosse Pointe and Watch Hill down to Needles and Pikesville. The best places socially would probably be found to those longest under occupation by financially prudent Anglo-Saxons, like Newport, Rhode Island, Haddam, Connecticut, and Bar Harbor, Maine. Los Angeles would rank low, less because it's ugly and banal than because it was owned by the Spanish for so long. A similar fact explains why St. Louis outranks San Antonio, Texas. That is, longest under occupation by financially prudent Anglo-Saxons, right? St. Louis obviously being much younger in that regard than Newport, Rhode Island, and so forth, but much older than San Antonio, Texas. Let's see. Another way to estimate a place's undesirability is to measure the degree to which religious fundamentalism is identified with it. Akron, Ohio is fatally known as the home of the Rex Humbard Ministry, the way Greenville, South Carolina is known as the seat of Bob Jones University, and Wheaton, Illinois is identified with Wheaton College and remembered thus as the forcing ground of the great Billy Graham. Likewise, Garden Grove, California, locus of the Reverend Robert Schuller. Can a higher class person live in Lynchburg, Virginia? Probably not, since that town was the origin of Dr. Jerry Falwell's radio emissions, the site of his church, and the mailing address for free will offerings. Hopefully some of you know some of these names here. They're familiar to me, most of them. So, where then may a member of the top classes live in this country? New York, first of all, of course. Chicago, San Francisco, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Boston, perhaps Cleveland. Deep in the countryside of Connecticut, New York State, Virginia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and that's about it. It's not considered good form to live in New Jersey, except in Bernardsville and perhaps Princeton. But any place in New Jersey beats Sunnyvale, Cypress, and Compton, California, Canton, Ohio, Reno, Nevada, Cheyenne, Wyoming, Albuquerque, New Mexico, Columbus, Georgia, and similar army towns. Impossible also are Evergreen, Colorado, because John Hinckley came from there, and Dallas, because, among many other good reasons, Lee Harvey Oswald lived there. It is said that experts on the subject regard Las Vegas as the world capital of tacky. So now, that's talking about the geography of those top three, the top, out of sight, upper, and upper middle. So let's turn to the next set of classes, starting with the middle class. The middle class is distinguishable more by its earnestness and psychic insecurity than by its middle income. I have known some very rich people who remain stubbornly middle class, which is to say they remain terrified at what others think of them, and to avoid criticism are obsessed with doing everything right. The middle class is the place where table manners assume an awful importance. The middle class, always anxious about offending, is the main market for mouthwashes. And if the middle class disappeared, the whole deodorant business would fall to the ground. If physicians tend to be upper middle class, dentists are gloomily aware that they're middle class. Status panic. That's the affliction of the middle class, according to C. Wright Mills, author of White Collar and the Power Elite. White Collar is one book and the Power Elite is another. Hence, the middle's need to accumulate credit cards and take in the New Yorker, which it imagines registers upper middle taste. So, a strange thing about the middle class is it seems to be the most rootless of the classes. They're the people who do most of the moving long distance, generally to very unstylish places, commanded every few years to pull up stakes by the corporations they're in bondage to. They are the geologist employed by the oil company, the computer programmer, me, the aeronautical engineer, the salesman assigned a new territory, and the marketing, formerly sales manager, deputed to keep an eye on him. These people and their families occupy the suburbs and developments. Terrified of losing their jobs, the middle class grow passive, their humanity diminished as they perceive themselves mere parts of an infinitely large structure, and interchangeable parts too. It's little wonder that, treated like slaves most of the time, the middle class lusts for the illusion of weight and consequence. This author's rough, isn't he? One sign is their quest for heraldic validation. Another is their custom of issuing annual family newsletters announcing the most recent triumphs in the race to become professional. And he gives a little made-up sample here. John, who is now 22, is in his first year at the dental school of Wayne State University. Caroline has a fine position as an executive secretary for a prestigious firm in Boise, Idaho. One who makes birth or wealth the sole criterion of worth. That's a conventional dictionary definition of a snob, and the place to look for the snob is in the middle class. So the middle class are the most class conscious, right? That's what he's saying. Correctness and doing the right thing become obsessions, prompting middle class people to write thank you notes after the most ordinary dinner parties. The desire to belong, and to belong by some mechanical act like purchasing something, is another sign of the middle class. And he gives some examples. Let's see. In Coming Up for Air, George Orwell, speaking for his middle class hero, gets it right. There's a lot of rot talked about the sufferings of the working class. I'm not so sorry for the proles myself. The prole suffers physically, but he's a free man when he isn't working. But in every one of those little stucco boxes, there's some poor bastard who's never free except when he's fast asleep. And why? As the author explains, because he's essentially a salesman. The middle class man develops a salesman style. He has to maintain appearances. His wife and children have to behave properly. A lot of pressure. Okay, I think that's enough on the middle class. let's go to the high proletarian. So, so what's the difference between the high proletarian class? A further lack of freedom and self-respect. Our former lower middle class, now the high proletarians, according to this author, now head the masses. And even if they are positioned at the top of the proletarian classes, still they are identifiable as people things are done to. They are in bondage to monetary policy, rip-off advertising, crazes and delusions, mass low culture, fast foods, consumer schlock. Back in the 40s, there was still a real lower middle class in this country whose solid high school education and addiction to saving and planning maintained it in a position, often precarious, to be sure, above the working class. But he believes that the inflation of the 60s and 70s pauperized that traditional lower middle class. And maybe also the fact that, as we've seen with education inflation, high school has become less and less useful as a basis for a solid career, and you have to go to college, but not everybody's going to go to college, right? So who are the high proles, the high proletarians? They're the skilled workers, craftsmen like printers. The mid proles are the operators like Ralph Cramden, the bus driver. The low proletarians are unskilled labor like longshoremen. The special anxiety of the high proletarians is fear about loss or reduction of status. The special anxiety of the mid-proletarians is fear of losing the job. And of the low proletarians, the gnawing perception that you're probably never going to make enough or earn enough freedom to have and do the things you want. One way to ascertain whether a person is middle class or high proletarian is to apply the principle that the wider the difference between one's working clothes and one's best, the lower the class. He says high proles are quite smart, or at least shrewd. Often their work is not closely supervised. They have pride and a conviction of independence, and they feel some contempt for those who have not made it as far as they have. They are, as the sociologist E.E. Lemasters called them and titles his book, blue-collar aristocrats. Okay, so middle class are your white-collar guys. High proletarians are your high, mid, low, or blue-collar, right? But high proletarians are the blue-collar aristocrats. One high prole says, if my boy wants to wear a goddamn necktie all his life and bow and scrape to some boss, that's his right. But by God, he should also have the right to earn an honest living with his hands if that is what he likes. So, like other aristocrats, these high proletarians have gone to the top of their social world and need not expend time or energy on social climbing. They are aristocratic in other ways, like their devotion to gambling and their fondness for deer hunting. The high prole resembles the aristocrat too, as Ortega y Gasset notes, in his propensity to make out of games and sports the central occupation of his life, as well as in his unromantic attitude toward women. Since the high proles are not consumed with worry about choosing the correct status emblems, unlike the middle class, they can be remarkably relaxed and unself-conscious. They can do, say, wear, and look like pretty much anything they want without feeling shame. Shame is largely a bourgeois feeling. And then this is quite interesting. Where men and women sit in the car, depending on your class. Get ready for this. Riding in sedans, high prole men sit in front with their wives planted in back. So you got, this is what he's painting here is a two-couple scenario. The high proletarians, the men will be sitting together in the front, the wives will be sitting together in the back, okay? As you move up to the middle class, one couple will be in front and one couple will be in back. But then when you get to the upper middles, you're likely to see a man and a woman of different couples sharing a seat. So the husband is sitting next to the wife of the other couple and vice versa in the back. Very interesting observation. He says all proles, all the proletarians have a high respect for advertising and brand names. High proles are nice. It's down among the mid proletarians and the low proletarians that features some might find offensive begin to show themselves. These are the people who feel bitter about their work, often because they are closely supervised and regulated and generally treated like wayward children. It's just like the army, says an auto assembly plant worker. No, it's worse. You just about need a pass to piss. The degree of supervision, indeed, is often a more eloquent class indicator than mere income, which suggests that the whole class system is more a recognition of the value of freedom than a proclamation of the value of sheer cash. The degree to which your work is overseen by a superior, excuse me, by a superior suggests your real class more accurately than the amount you take home from it. So this is the reason why a high school teacher is lower than a tenured university professor. The teacher is obliged to file weekly lesson plans with a principal or something. The professor reports to on the other hand, reports to no one, and his class is thus higher, even though the teacher might be smarter, better mannered, and richer. It is in public schools, the postal service, and police departments that we meet terms like supervisor and inspector. The prole hunter will need to know no more, he says. One is a mid or low prole if one's servitude is constantly emphasized. Occupational class depends very largely on doing work for which the consequences of error or failure are distant or remote, or better, invisible, rather than immediately apparent to a superior and thus instantly humiliating to the performer. So the quicker the feedback, the lower class you are. Or the more roundabout the feedback, the higher class. So a clique, that's who run things, says mid and low proles, retreating into their, excuse me, private pursuits, home workshops and household repairs. This is now the mid and low proles, right? Washing and polishing the car, playing poker, fishing, hunting, camping, watching sports and westerns on TV, identifying with quarterback or hero, visiting relatives. Most upper middles and uppers, by contrast, are in flight from their relatives and visit friends instead. I gotta mark that passage. I'm thinking of someone who I should share it with. And family shopping at the local mall on Saturday or Sunday. These are activities of the mid and low proles. Now, the low proletarians. At the bottom of the working class, the low prole is identifiable by the gross uncertainty of his employment. This class would include illegal aliens like Mexican fruit pickers, as well as other migrant workers. Socially, each day and each week is almost unplanned. There's no diary, no book of engagements, and few letters are sent or received. There's often remoteness or isolation, as in the valleys of Appalachia. And down here, we find people who, trained for nothing, are likely out of sheer wayward despair to join the army. So low proletarians would often make up the grunts, right, in the Marines or the army. Now, we get to the final two, the destitute. Actually, does he talk about the bottom out of sight? Oh, okay, yeah, I'll just read this paragraph. It very briefly covers these last two. Still, the low proletarian are better off than the destitute, who never have even seasonal work and who live wholly on welfare. They differ from the bottom out of sights less because they're much better off than because they're more visible, in the form of Bowery bums, bag ladies, people who stand in public places lecturing and delivering harangues about their grievances, people who drink out of paper bags, people whose need for some recognition impels them to act in front of audiences in the street. When delinquency and distress grow desperate, you sink into the bottom out of sight class, staying all day in your welfare room or contriving to get taken into an institution, whether charitable or correctional, doesn't matter much. I don't know why he treats with them so briefly, but the destitute and the bottom out of sight are somewhat familiar to me from working with inner city kids for some years. Drinking out of paper bags, I remember seeing that in North St. Louis in the ghetto areas there at the time. Just sort of a drugged, guys would be standing around with a drugged out look on their face on the street corner, These are the destitute, and then some of them, as he says, sink into the bottom out of sight. And they're in prison and things like that. Or, yeah, I don't know what the homeless would be. The homeless encampments. Are those the bottom out of sight? We can see them though. Anyway, somewhere in between destitute and bottom out of sight. So, thus, the classes, according to Paul Fussell: top out of sight, upper, upper middle, middle, high proletarian, mid proletarian, low proletarian, destitute, and bottom out of sight. They are usefully imagined as a line of theaters running side by side down a long street. Each has a marquee and lots of posters on the front. Plays about self-respect are running constantly in all of them, from the most comfortable to the barest and meanest. But the odd thing is that there's no promotion from one theater to the next one up. And the important point is this: there's no one playing in any of these theaters, no matter how imposing, who isn't, much of the time, scared to death that he's going to stumble, muff his lines, appear in the wrong costume, or otherwise bomb. If you find an American who feels entirely class secure, stuff and exhibit him. He's a rare specimen. So I think I'll stop there. The next chapter, just as a teaser, I do want to continue because it's great stuff, is called Appearance Counts. And he gets into details of the differing appearance of the different classes. And it gets really, really funny. Let's see, I think I'll leave that slide up while I look at any chats. Let's see here. All right. Okay, I'll glance over the chat, see if anything jumps out here. I already shared some of what Grant said at the beginning. Harold Bredsdorf says, somebody in your class, they understand your gifts. Or GIFs, however you say it. Sigan the Loyal, great observation. I knew an upper class kid who desperately wanted to be ghetto. People are odd. FBI informant says, uh-oh, is this not working? Oh, sorry. I got scared because my YouTube was not loaded right. Okay, not gonna worry about it. I'm broadcasting fine. Okay, where was I? FBI informant. Very interesting, but so far I think that he's leaving out ethnic heritage. Yes, exactly. Scots-Irish versus Puritans, German farmer kulaks, Jewish, Dutch, black, etc. Yes, he explicitly says he's not looking at it from that angle. He's just looking at it from the point of ethnic, social class. And he also mentions that the Old Glory Club has a series called American Spirits, where they're covering kind of American identity, I guess you could say. They've done a fascinating overview of some of the ethnic history. So very cool. T. Swan says, imagine living your entire life and never buying groceries. Sigan the Loyal says they do no simple tasks for themselves. Let's see. Sigan the Loyal says upper class are smelly. Well, I don't know about that. I doubt it. They probably just don't use deodorant. They just are able to be comfortable such that they're not getting all sweaty. You know, they shower every day and don't smell bad. Yeah, Nudge Unit says always the poor kids in school who went out of their way to get the latest fad products. FBI informant. The more recent homeless phenomenon is a new class, perhaps. New forces were introduced to create and perpetuate that class. Yes, and we might have to meditate on the phenomena of the new homeless class in light of what we learn in this book later, and think about sort of where they fit in or don't fit in, right? How novel is this, what we're seeing? And then finally, T. Swan says, upper middle justifies themselves by doting on the destitute and bottom out of sight. So they have to be visible for the upper class to get the moral kudos for doting on them. Yeah, yeah, very good. Okay, so I hope you found this interesting. I thought it was funny and sharp in the observations. And I finished the next chapter, but I need to finish reading the rest of the book, and I'd like to share more of it with you. I think it's very interesting and, of course, very right-wing, you might say, because it's getting into not thinking of everyone the same, but focusing on the differences, right? The differences in behaviors and the differences in oh, and differences that are sticky. That's another one, right? He's pushing against the idea that, as with the mass immigration arguments, that we can just ship people in and they can become British people. They can become Americanized, He's pushing against some of that and saying, actually, your ways, your cultural ways, your class ways are pretty sticky. When you're brought up in a certain class, for example, you tend to behave that way even if your circumstances change. You get a lot more money or a lot less money than you once had. You might continue with the habits of your class in terms of how you dress and shame and concern about what other people think, right? All that sort of thing. An ongoing mystery for myself, pretty certainly belonging to the middle class here, is that I don't have very much of that shame. It's been remarked upon ever since I was a teenager. Friends, without me asking, just said, how are you like the way you are? You just seem to kind of do your thing and not care what everyone thinks. And I don't have an answer to that. I did have quite extraordinary parents, and it probably had something to do with them. But yeah, I seem to be a little more not middle class in that regard, in terms of how I function. I'm not sitting there spending a lot of time thinking about appearing, with a car that's going to impress people and stuff like that. I just don't think that way. So anyway, I hope you found this interesting and find it a fun exercise to, first of all, classify yourself and see what you vibe with from the descriptions he gave, and then start sort of noticing things as you interact with folks. I think it's great fun. I think I'll continue with it. I like it. In fact, we'll see. He wasn't available this week, but I would love to bring Black Horse in. Oh, I meant to say this at the beginning. I'll have to put this in the show notes. I see this as a sort of sequel to a wonderful stream that Black Horse did with me, where he brought his insights on the financial habits of different classes, where he's really had interactions with that whole range that we were just looking at from Fussell. Black Horse used different terms to refer to them, but he was really talking about all of those. For example, he talked a lot about what here is called the top out of class. I forget the term he used, but basically he talked about these families that are able to keep a family legacy going for generation after generation after generation, a remarkably stable set of families that are able to keep that going. Again, showing some of that stickiness that Fussell is arguing for, right? That the families that stay in that top out of class place, it does change, but it doesn't change as much as you'd think. It isn't just a whole new set of families every generation, because there's families that have been there for hundreds of years. So, what does that mean? Various things we can think about there. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. I'm glad to be back. Should keep it going. I think this will probably take me 2 more episodes to get through this book if I continue to go at this pace. We'll see if it stays this interesting. So far, I think it's absolutely gripping. The next chapter I'm really excited to cover. So we will stop there. And let's see. Oh, more comments coming in. Let's see if anything. Sigan the Loyal says there are women who refuse deodorant. They just use swaths of perfume. Okay. Right. Okay. So let's stop there and look forward to seeing everybody next week.